Episode 12, The Hospice, Part 2. I had other encounters whilst working at the hospice. After the incident with the wheezing man in room 4W, I was very much on my guard during my night shifts. Several weeks went by, and other than the usual knocks, odd sounds of whispering, and also the unusual nighttime moving shadows in the dark, nothing much happened. I certainly didn't consider the place haunted in the traditional sense, although I do stand by what happened in room 4W is still unexplained and bothers me to this day. The next time I encountered anything unexplained was on the west wing and in the day room. During this time I'd been asked if I could move to a residency on a more permanent basis. Hospice life isn't for all nurses. Several had left over the course of a few weeks, in turn leaving quite a few holes in the staff rota. Of course, the temps were always expensive to hire at short notice and not nearly as reliable as the vocational staff such as myself. By this point I had a good working relationship with the senior sister and had been promoted to a deputy position. This meant quite a few more weeks staying on site overnight, but that didn't bother me at all. The money was slightly better and the board was included. It was such a good deal that I rarely returned to the apartment that I shared with Charlotte. Quite often I didn't leave the premises anyway before or after shifts. Sometimes I was quite happy to change into my civvies, go to the rec room and play a few board games with the residents. I very much became a live-in nurse. I retained a permanent room upstairs which was located above East Wing. Generally the sound insulation was okay, but you could of course hear any louder noises that came from the wing below. In general day-to-day life though, your brain would sort of filter them out. That was except for the noise coming from one patient in particular. There was a patient by the name of Mr. Green. I'm of the understanding that other names and the hospice name itself will be changed in the telling of this story for anonymity reasons. However, this one will be kept as is. You'll understand why in a bit. Mr. Green occupied the room directly below mine on East Wing. He was a patient with advanced dementia. This was further complicated by a stroke and several falls that he had suffered. Putting it diplomatically, he was hard work. In his younger years, he'd been a businessman and used to his independence. In these final weeks, he struggled to walk without the aid of a walking stick and had bouts of quite extreme mood swings. He had the type of dementia that could leave him completely frustrated and angry at a moment's notice. During his final weeks, he had taken to banging his stick on the ceiling. This could be day or night time. It wasn't the consistent knocking sound we would hear periodically through the building though. This was an absolutely undeniably loud bang from the stick on the ceiling. It was with enough force that you could feel it through my bedroom floor. It seemed to be an attention thing with him. On occasions we would have to have the resident doctor administer a sedative during his more aggressive episodes. Looking back, really he needed specialist care in a more appropriate setting. By no means was it his fault that he was aggressive. All the same though, it wasn't a great situation to be around for the staff or other residents. I certainly had many a night's sleep disrupted by his banging. It was during this time I had also struck up a good friendship with some of the residents on the West Wing. As I was on site on a more permanent basis, in my downtime I would often play classic games such as Monopoly, chess and backgammon with some of them in the rec room. As was the cycle of the hospice, we had several deaths of cancer patients staying on the West Wing. There were quite a few heartbreaking cases. None hit me quite as hard as that of a teenage boy called Ed though. Ed had late-stage leukemia, and as with every resident at the hospice, it was only a matter of time before he left us. He was ambitious, friendly and funny. He was half the age of most of the residents on West Wing, but had one of the most mature outlooks there. As a result, he was incredibly popular with the other residents and staff. He loved to play board games to pass the days. Ed had a wicked sense of humour. He found it hilarious to sometimes play dead when I came in to check on his stats. His gallows humour was incredible. I'd been present when the doctor confirmed that he'd only had 4 to 5 months to live as an estimate. He simply smiled and turned to me saying that he'd save me money as I didn't need to invest in a Christmas card for him that year. I was there with him and his family when he passed. By the end, he was no more than a skeleton, ravaged by the disease. It's one of the very few times that I've ever broken down in front of a family. Ed was far more than a patient. He was a good friend that I looked forward to seeing each day. His parents understood how close we were and were happy that I had been there. On the insistence of the senior sister, I took time off work after having first attended his funeral. In total, I was gone for 3 weeks to spend time away from the situation. I loved my job and that I could make a difference to people's lives in quite often desperate situations. However, in reflection, there's a good reason that so many nurses go off with stress. It really is important to think carefully about the need to take time away if you need it. Although death was routine and familiar, it's amazing how quickly grief can overwhelm even experienced nurses. I returned to the hospice with a somewhat fresh perspective. Ed's room was now occupied by another resident. His personal belongings now moved on. The first night back, I returned to my room above East Wing after dark. I'd been held up by some local flooding. I went straight to bed in order to be ready for my first shift back in the morning. It was around 2 AM and sure enough, just as I was drifting off, it started. The familiar loud banging of Mr. Green's stick on the floor below me. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. I don't know why, but for some reason it just really annoyed me even more than usual. I was tired and still apprehensive about returning. However, something about that banging just enraged me. After 5 minutes, the on-duty nurses had done nothing, so I decided to go down myself. I slipped on my work uniform and headed down there to see what was going on. I marched past the 2 temporary nurses on reception and gave them my best annoyed stare as I did so. As I got to the East Wing corridor, the banging still continued. Still angry, I opened up Mr. Green's door forcefully and stepped inside. But he wasn't there. In the bed was an old lady, hooked up to a ventilator, sleeping peacefully. I backed out quietly, as I'd obviously got the room wrong. But I hadn't. This was Mr. Green's room. But he couldn't be far, due to the banging on the ceiling with his stick being so loud. I looked at the names on the doors either side, neither with his name. Then I looked further along the doors. None appeared to be Mr. Green's room. It was at this point that both of the nurses from reception gingerly entered the East Wing corridor. I asked, "Where's Mr. Green? Why haven't you been here?" The first nurse spoke. She seemed rather confused. She explained that Mr. Green had passed away over a week ago. For some reason, my brain couldn't compute this. I said, "But what about the banging?" They looked at each other in confusion. Neither admitted to hearing anything that night. I straight up accused them of not doing their rounds and being where they should. There was just no way they could not have heard the banging if they were in the nurses' station. I told them that I'd be speaking to the senior sister in the morning, pushed past them and went back to bed. The next morning I signed on to my shift and went straight to see the senior sister at the nurses' station to explain about what had happened last night. She confirmed that Mr. Green had indeed passed away during my absence. I remember adamantly telling her that there had been a loud banging in the room below me. Perhaps it hadn't been Mr. Green, but for sure something made that sound. It was just too loud to ignore. I know that I wasn't mistaken. The senior sister did follow up with the 2 temporary nurses by phone that morning. Both maintained that there had been no unexpected noises from the East Wing that night, and that all correct checks had been carried out. This obviously put the senior sister in a bit of a predicament. In the end, the only thing she could do was agree with me that I'd heard something, but the noise had perhaps not come from below me on the East Wing. Therefore, the nurses downstairs hadn't heard it as I had done. It wasn't a satisfying explanation on my part, but I had no proof otherwise. So this is where things started to escalate. On night shifts, I began to hear noises on a regular basis. Typically, one nurse would make their round of the wing whilst the other stayed at the nurses' station. We would then swap over. I remember being on East Wing having just carried out my checks. As I turned to walk back along the corridor, I distinctly felt as if I was being watched by someone. Then, as I walked, I heard the distinctive sound of a human shuffle. It was accompanied by the sound of a walking stick impacting on the carpet. As I walked, the dull thud and shuffling sound followed me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was no one there. It's hard to explain unless you were there, but I felt like I was being watched. Whatever it was, it felt like it had an angry presence. I wasn't panicked, I was very aware of my surroundings, which made the situation all the more intense. To get to the nurses' station, I started to walk faster. The shuffling behind me increased its speed, as if chasing me down the corridor. It was clear that I was flustered by the time I spoke to Harriet, who was on duty with me that night. Harriet was one of the newer nurses. She was young and had a bubbly personality. She was intrigued rather than frightened by what I had told her, and offered to go back and check. I sat at the nurses' station while she investigated. I remember looking around me. This time I thought I could see movement in the day room that led to the west wing. A sort of shadow amongst the chairs. It seemed to creep along, almost as if not wanting to be seen. It made me physically jump, as I hadn't expected to see anyone in there at that time. Harriet returned and reported nothing unusual from East Wing. Whatever I had heard seemed to have moved on. I now told her about the shadowy figure that I had just seen in the day room. It could just have been a resident out of bed, but I needed to check all the same. I got the sense from Harriet that she thought I was just making things up, or paranoid now. Harriet stayed at the nurses' station as I entered the day room. Nothing seemed particularly amiss, but I had that strong sensation again that I was being watched from the corner of the room, somewhere. Perhaps from behind some curtains. I really didn't like the sensation. Being so certain that someone was there, I decided to make a round of the room. I entered the rec room just off from the main day room. It was dark and empty with no obvious signs of disturbance. The room was left neatly with a small pile of magazines on the coffee table in the middle. On top of a tall cabinet sat a pile of neatly stacked board games. As I was leaving the room, I got the fright of the night so far, as there was a sudden crash behind me. I turned quickly, ready to punch someone, but there was no one there. On the floor, though, was the box for the game Cluedo. It couldn't have been me that had knocked it off. It was too high to casually disturb. I looked around but saw no one. Picking up the board and cards, it dawned on me that this had been the last game that I'd played with Ed, the teenager that had passed away a few weeks ago. I knew it was our game, as we had left it midway. Ed had gotten tired all of a sudden, so we took him for a lay down. Purposefully, I made a note of whose turn it was and on which squares the pieces were on a piece of notepaper, so that we could resume the game when he felt better. It was a game that we never did get to finish. As I packed up the pieces, I decided to look in the black solution pouch to put all the cards together. You know, the pouch that contains the murderer, the weapon and the location cards, placed in there at the start of the game. For reference, the solution was Reverend Green in the conservatory with the lead piping. I don't know why, but this gave me a strong feeling that I needed to check the conservatory that was just off the day room. I placed the cards back in the box and walked slowly back to the day room. From there, I could hear the distinct sound of the shuffling, once more accompanied by the sound of what sounded like a walking stick on the carpet. It sounded as if it was coming from the conservatory. I walked over to the conservatory door, picking up a mug as I did so. I had no idea what I was going to do with it, but I felt that it could be at least used as some type of weapon if someone jumped out on me. I looked through the glass door, into the conservatory. To my surprise, someone was standing there, frozen to the spot, motionless. It was Harriet. She was facing away from me, looking out into the garden. I relaxed a little and walked in. Initially she flinched, but then grabbed me tightly on the arm when she realised it was me. "He's here," she said in an urgent whisper. This freaked me out a little, just because of the way she said it. She was clearly petrified of something. "The man with the walking stick." She was still looking out into the garden, except she wasn't. She was looking at the reflection in the conservatory glass. Sure enough, in the reflection, we both saw Mr. Green, the elderly man with the walking stick. He was standing in the room behind us. To my eyes, he appeared more of a shadow figure, but with the man's features, it was truly terrifying. This wasn't imagined, we both saw it together. I turned, but he was not physically in the room. In the reflection though, we saw him bang his stick on the carpet angrily. We heard the noise as if he was next to us. By this point we both bolted out, across the day room and back to the nurses' station. I can't tell you just how scared we both were. I speed dialed up to the staff room upstairs to raise whoever I could. Moments later, one of the doctors joined us in the nurses' station. We explained what we had seen, but he seemed particularly unimpressed. He had of course expected a medical emergency, not some ghost story from two hysterical nurses. To his credit, he walked with us to both the East Wing and through the day room and conservatory. As you might imagine, there was no presence there. The doctor clearly put it down to overactive imaginations on a night shift. There was nothing he could do to help, other than listen to us and calm us down. He returned to the staff room to sleep and left us to our duties. Harriet and myself spoke all night about what happened. Harriet had only been in the conservatory as she had heard a loud noise and then came to check on me. This was presumably the sound of the Cluedo box falling. I shared my side of events with her. Finding the green character in the conservatory with the lead piping as a solution now gave me chills. It was almost as if it was fate, or a message of some kind. It seemed to almost represent what had just happened. There are 324 possible solutions in the game of Cluedo. The fact that my final game with Ed had this solution baffles me to this day. Was it a message? A warning perhaps? Or just coincidence? Either way, in combination with the box dropping and the sighting of the deceased Mr. Green shortly after, it's something that still gives me chills, and I really can't explain it. I continued to work at the hospice for some time after these events. After a few years, I myself became the senior sister. I only ever experienced minor unexplained happenings after these events myself. However, many of my own staff that have come and gone over the years have shared their own unexplained stories. If you have an interest in hearing them, please get in contact and I can try to help track them down if that would be helpful for your channel. As for myself, I'm just happy that I've never witnessed anything as scary as those events ever again in my life. If you enjoyed this week's paranormal story, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more tales of the supernatural and the unexplained. Until next time, my friends, happy hauntings.